I tried to fly above the angels with nothing but self-centeredness. But I only found the way to heaven from wandering in the wilderness.
This weekend, for the first time since the pandemic began, Vicki and I left home to travel over to Atlanta and back in one day just to check on my mom and dad. They're both in their upper 80s and they've had a lot of health issues in recent years. We found them well. We sat outside together in by their little apartment, more than 6 feet apart, and we visited together outside for a few hours. And at one point, my dad and I donned our masks and we went to a local Walmart to pick up something. Most of the people there had on masks. Many did not. Some seemed kind of proud about it. A friend told me about going to a restaurant that just reopened in a small town. Every other table had been carefully marked off for social distancing, and my friend and her husband were seated. They and the workers there were the only people wearing masks. One couple came to the door and began arguing violently because they wanted to be seated right then, and they were asked to wait. They insisted that half the tables were empty and they had a right to be seated. It got so bad the police had to be called. Now, what was the reasoning in this? Not so noble, folks. We can't stand to wait to be put out for somebody else. And the masks? Well, it's an inconvenience to protect others in case you're carrying the virus and don't know it. You know, it's pretty well proven that if two people are talking to each other 6 feet apart with masks on, the chance of spreading the virus to either of them is almost non-existent. There was a crowded pool party on the news yesterday. A young man was interviewed about it. He said, "Hey, if I get the virus, I get it." Almost 30 years ago, I was invited to speak at a conference on church growth, and all of the speakers then were very enamored with new and innovative things about church and how we could eliminate things that would offend people wanting to get involved in church. And in and of themselves, some of them were pretty innocent and innocuous. But the part that troubled me most at the time was the disappearance of anything resembling a sense of obligation on our part for the sake of the church's growth. And that growth was defined during the day almost exclusively as numerical growth, without asking questions about what other kinds of growth did we need to have. I was the next to the last speaker that day. Many of my friends were there, and the longer the conference went on, the more worried I was about what I had prepared. I thought, I'm going to rain on the parade. I'd just been through a great time of spiritual awakening in my life, finding myself challenged about a lot of things about me, and I found myself going in a very different direction from that day. So my 3 points that day were these. I think in this time, the calling of the church might be irrelevance and inconvenience and presence. My intentions were good, even if the presentation was not all that great. But as I recall it, I was asking, what does the world really need right now? What do the people we are trying to bring to deeper spiritual growth really needing? There was a tendency then, and still for that matter, to be preoccupied with what is successful, what will attract large numbers of people to come and join us and prove in this culture that is obsessed with success that we're the best. What will people like? What will make it more pleasant for them? And none of those things are all bad. Some of the questions were very good ones. Sometimes, though, we've been better at going out of our way not to ask anything of people, or not to offend people, or failing to adapt when it had little to do with the gospel at all. The other side, of course, is that my points were saying being a little irrelevant is not always a bad thing. Mimicking a culture, trying to be just like it, is not always so great if that spirit's wrong. Convenience can be a double-edged sword. It's great if you can drink coffee at church and be comfortable and sit in a seat that feels good. But there come times in the Christian walk when you're asked to lay aside something you want for somebody else. And I don't want that to be lost in the process. It's a profoundly inconvenient matter to love others. It means the surrender of our selfishness. It means the laying aside of our own wants for the sake of the other person. 1 Corinthians 13 is replete with this inconvenience as a spiritual practice. Paul writes, "Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres." It's an irony to me that we most often read this passage at weddings, but what it's really about is the fellowship of the Christian church and human beings with one another. Paul was calling on the early Christians to put up with each other. They were in a church that was clamoring for everybody to get in the best position and the best place. Paul asked them to lay aside their demanding nature for the sake of each other. Patience and kindness, not self-glorification, avoiding anger, avoiding blaming and persevering with each other and protecting each other being what he really wanted to see in the church. I can't think of a more mature calling for this present moment than that. For we live not only amid a pandemic, but in an atmosphere of glorified selfishness and demanding attitudes. And the idea that anyone give up their claims for someone else's well-being has now been put before us. And we have been so eroded by tribalism on all sides and being able to live without needing each other. And now we've been called on to help each other out. I'm thankful that most people seem to be getting that message, but there are way too many who haven't. You see, that's how we're going to survive this. The healing will come, but unless we are unselfish and working for it together, we will extend the suffering longer. There is so little asked of us who are not physicians about helping. Do with less, share with those who are in need, refrain from anger and blaming, forgive, pray for others. This pandemic has shone a light on our pain very deeply, and at a time when we need a spirit of being in it together, we are actually struggling to do it for a long period of time. Put on a mask. Stay apart for the sake of each other. Bear patiently with each other. I'm concerned about the virus, but I'm a lot more concerned about self-centeredness and immaturity, because even after the vaccine comes, it'll still be here. There is a better way to live. The thing about rights is that they are really a privilege, and they ask responsibility from us. And sometimes the greatest gift we have in our rights is to choose not to exercise them, even if we can, for the sake of somebody else. Would you pray with me? For those who are surviving, O God, we understand. In desperation, people clamor for help. But for those of us for whom this is merely inconvenience, a time of irritation, a time of taking a little bit of trouble, would you help us to take up the cross for our neighbor and bear with them? In Jesus' name, amen.